Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual Saturday symposia. My name is Jan Saragoni, and I'm both a Harvard Club member and acting chair of its Member Engagement Committee. I'm also an alum of the Kennedy School of Government. Just some housekeeping. Please note that if you have a question for Professor Lepore, send it along with the Q&A feature. And also note that the professor's full bio will be added to the chat via link. I'm just going to quickly kick this off by saying Professor Lepore's latest book, If Then, How the Simulatics Corporation Invented the Future, who even heard of the word simulatics, was released in September during the pandemic, no less. And it has been shortlisted for the National Book Award. It's a fascinating analysis of how a group of data scientists during the campaign of John F. Kennedy designed a model to manipulate American voters. It sounds kind of familiar. In her last book, These Truths, A History of the United States, Professor Lepore wrote that, quote, to study the past is to unlock the prison of the present. It's also been said that Professor Lepore is an historian who doesn't ignore recent history. And she herself has written that, quote, the study of history requires investigation, imagination, empathy, and respect. Reverence just doesn't enter into it. And I'm sure we will hear many reminders of that during her talk. And with that, it is with great delight that I invite Professor Lepore to begin her lecture.
Hi, thanks so much for that kind introduction. It's lovely to be with you all on what here in Cambridge is a very rainy afternoon, a big disappointment for those of us who are expecting a foot of snow so that being locked in our houses somehow feel better. Sorry not to be with you all in a beautiful room in downtown Boston, but delighted to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about the course of American history and sort of where we are at this moment in the grander story of American history. So I've been teaching a fairly new class in the college the last few years. It's called the Democracy Project. And I try to offer up a way of thinking about American history in a single semester, what used to be called a kind of old-fashioned survey class, but I've tried to reinvent it in some new ways and taught it in a very different way by Zoom this year. But so the lecture I'm going to give today comes a little bit out of my thinking about the sweep of American history and how to make ways to make that absorbable, not to say fed to people, but a provocation about the structure of American history that might be surprising and profitable for those of us who are kind of struggling to understand this moment as a moment in time, which I think is honestly most of us. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is show you some slides and kind of talk you through graphically some representations of the United States over time. The title of my talk is This America, That America. And in a way, what I want us to try to think about together and puzzle over, and I'm looking forward to Q&A about this, is, the question that we all, I think, struggle with is, what is the state of the nation today? And, what can we expect in the year ahead? 2020 has been an utterly unmoored year. So what is the vantage of the past that we can gain by trying to kind of collapse several centuries into, here we have, 45 minutes or so. So that's the ambition that I have today. And so the way that I'm going to try to do that is by looking at some images together. And then we will have some time to kind of talk about what we learn from picturing the nation this way. So I am going to share my screen. Okay, so this is one of my favorite representations of the troubled state of the United States today. It's a neon installation by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon called Double America. It's from a series of works that he produced that are all about the division in the United States in recent years. Ligon has said that he was inspired by the first lines of Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Really trying to think of a graphic way to represent, and here I think quite a powerfully successful way to represent, what looks to half of Americans up looks to the other half of Americans down. that we live in not just different countries, but oppositional countries. So what I want to think about then historically is how did we get here, and what are some ways that looking even at art can help us just think about this problem historically. So partly what I want to think about is the question of division in the United States, the kind of the ways in which I think for many people, it seems as though the country is falling to pieces. We're looking here at a 19th century jigsaw puzzle box of the United States. Probably most of you have done jigsaw puzzles, as children or with your kids, puzzles that represent the country. It's a really interesting to me metaphor for our current dilemma, the sense that we have that the country is broken metaphorically, that it has gone to pieces. We think about gerrymandering and other ways that we draw lines on the map, but we can think about it in this very material way with regard to thinking about the image of the jigsaw puzzle. So that's one image I want to plant in your mind as we begin. So I want to start in 1754 with this now quite famous and indeed iconographic representation of Britain's mainland colonies, a woodcut that appeared in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, in 1754. Franklin, of course, had argued for a defensive union. He thought the colonies ought to form a plan of union and proposed that at a Congress held in Albany, New York in 1754. The proposal was approved by the delegates, but down in the colonies themselves, and was opposed by the British Empire in any case, which wasn't interested in the colonies forming any kind of a union. This was in the immediate prelude to the French and Indian War, what was also known as the 7 Years' War. But what I want to think about when looking at this image, because I think it is so powerful, obviously this image has a long afterlife. It's a motif in the Tea Party movement. It has a lot of graphic presence in American polarized politics today. But at the time, Franklin was calling on several really interesting ways to represent political division. So for one thing, one way to think about this image is that it's a political cartoon, most obviously, but it's also a map. So, it's conventional now that we always put north at the top of a map, but that was not conventional then. So here north is on the right-hand side of the map. You see New England here, the tongue of the serpent is pointing to the top of New England. Then if you follow the snake's body through New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, you can see that we're looking north to south at a map of the Atlantic coast and along the coast. So there's a way in which it's not just a random political cartoon. It also works as a map for people who were thinking all the time about where they were located relative to one another geographically. But it is also a jigsaw puzzle. This was what was known as, this is a dissected snake, like literally dissected snake. But jigsaw puzzles were invented in just this moment, and they were invented by map makers and called dissected maps. So Franklin, who is a printer, knows a lot about what's going on in the world of printing. And what he's doing is taking an interest in this new idea that London map makers had, which was to take a map and paste it onto a wooden board, and then with a jigsaw, saw out all the different geographical pieces and then sell these things. We call them jigsaw puzzles, but they were called dissected maps at the time. Here's a really, really jigsaw puzzle. It's called Europe Divided into Its Kingdoms. And one of the reasons why this is really important in terms of my big question about how we represent division or union in the United States down to our present is that, of course, we know that nations are essentially legal fictions, right? Lines drawn on a map are drawn by our imagination. They're not meaningless. I mean, they can be enforced. We could build walls along those lines. For instance, many of them are mountain ranges or rivers. But for the most part, the lines that divide nation states, including here, the kingdoms of Europe, are legal fictions. They're acts of law rather than laws of nature. And so something about this process of map makers creating these jigsaw puzzles had the effect in some ways of kind of naturalizing national boundaries. That is to say, if you could picture the place that you lived in this way, it became real to you in a new way. So you're a Frenchman, you're a French woman, France now looks like this. It's this particular shape and size. It has this, maybe it's often rendered in the same color in maps. Like it has a prominent role in the creation of national identities and the emergence of nationalism, which is a late 18th century notion. So there's something, in other words, really closely tied together, I would suggest then, in the relationship of how a place is depicted in a map and how people think about the place where they live and their political identity within it. So we can begin, I want to sort of propose that, and now that's on the table, right? That we live in a divided country. We live in a country that pictures itself as divided. One way that people picture the places that they live is how they picture maps. And one way that we picture maps historically comes from these dissected maps of the 18th century, which were an element of the emergence of nationalism. So of course, there's a lot of other ways that we and other peoples around the world picture ourselves graphically. And in the United States, we picture ourselves graphically, not just as a place on a map, but as a people whose frame of government is embodied in a constitution or a charter, right? The Constitution, US Constitution is a charter, which has the same root as the word chart or map, right? A charter is the Constitution. A Constitution is also, if you have a good Constitution, you are a healthy person. A Constitution describes the constitution of your body. And here, the way we talk about a Constitution with regard to this legal instrument of the US Constitution as a frame of government is as what constitutes the body politic. So here, we, the people, are instantiated or embodied by this document, which, because it is printed and circulated in 1787, I mean, just days after the Constitutional Convention adjourns in September of 1787, the draft goes to the printer. People read the Constitution in their newspapers. It came in their almanacs. You would see it tacked up on the wall in a tavern. The document itself, like here is the set of rules by which we will constitute a federal government. This is a new thing under the sun. It's not that frames of government were new or that everything in the Constitution was new, but the act of writing down an agreement for how people will consent to be governed and then having the people ratify it through the process of ratification under which we adopted this frame of government is actually new. So a big part of how Americans think of themselves as a people, certainly historically, comes down to this moment and the drafting, and then particularly the deliberating over and the ratification of the Constitution as a kind of embodiment of the people as represented by a piece of paper, right? So it is graphic in its way. And of course now the Constitution as a graphic image, usually we see the handwritten version with a giant, kind of bird's claw that is like a facsimile of the Constitution, the original Constitution that's in the National Archives. Nobody saw that until the 1950s in kind of mass duplication. Like that was not the way people pictured the Constitution. They pictured it this way. But we now think about that. In fact, we fetishize that hand-drawn "We the People" as this representation of the country and the agreement under which we live. So if there's this incredible celebration of the coming together of the people, the we-ness of the people under the Constitution, there is from the very beginning of the American Republic another way of thinking about not we, but us and them, which is crucial to what becomes to the anti-slavery movement and what becomes the abolition movement. I want to look for a minute at this beautiful painting from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There are other copies of it, but if you're in New York, I urge you to go see it. That, as you can immediately discern, is not an image of unity or union of the people of the United States. So what we have here on the left-hand side of the painting, the seated figure, the pale in a white dress female figure is Liberty. She's the iconographic representation of liberty, shows the ancestor of what will become, the Statue of Liberty. We know that she's Liberty because she has a liberty cap on top of a staff, which is just the symbol of liberty at the time. But you look at this image, what you should really do is divide it along the diagonal. So even on, looking at your screen, if you take your finger and go to the upper left-hand corner of this image and then draw a diagonal with your finger down to the lower right-hand corner, everything on the left left of that diagonal line, it represents liberty, and everything to the right represents slavery. So this is an image of division and of profound division and opposition. So associated with liberty, this European American woman on the left are all the arts and sciences, all the knowledge from antiquity, the knowledge of books, the knowledge of geography, the arts of sculpture and painting and architecture, the world of science, all the world of learning, from the ancients to the moderns. And on the right-hand side of that diagonal line is a group of people kneeling before liberty, beseeching for the bounty of liberty, first of all, emancipation, but all these things that are denied to people held in human bondage. And if you look kind of straight across the picture, kind of midway up the frame on the right, the woman with the kerchief on her head is meant to be the opposite of liberty. This is an iconographic, an allegorical representation of slavery. So we think a lot about liberty as an allegorical representation, but there is her opposite, slavery, that is present throughout American graphic arts throughout the 19th century, kind of all the way down to, and this is among the many reasons for the long-standing campaign to get rid of Aunt Jemima as the icon on pancakes. Like Aunt Jemima, that the kerchiefed Black woman is an allegorical representation of slavery that goes very, very, very far back. So the deprivation that these people experienced denied all of the learning in the arts and that's represented, that comes with liberty, because early Americans understood that among the astonishing wonders of living in this republic was that the people would have access, that ordinary people we would live in an age of enlightenment of the arts and sciences that were to be celebrated and distributed and diffused throughout the population in a republic, unlike in a monarchy. You can think about the same moment as characterized by a lot of quite explicit engagement with the work of dividing space and the artificiality of those lines on maps that divide European kingdoms from other European kingdoms, but increasingly self-consciousness on the part of European empires, the way they are carving up the rest of the world, particularly the world of the Americas. So here, England and France are, sort of divvying up a plum pudding. That's Napoleon on the right. There's if you think about the presence of the globe in this image, the presence of the globe in this image is, of course, quite different. But just to say that people at the time were very actively, of course, thinking about the acts of empire in which they were engaging, the taking of land in nearly all instances from indigenous peoples. And we're talking about the Americas here. There's a way in which, of course, American map makers make that taking of land both explicit and hidden, very much concealed, after both before and after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 under Jefferson's presidency. Maps that are now, this is a very different representation of the United States than Benjamin Franklin's 1754 political cartoon. This is obviously geographically accurate map of the states that make up the Union that is the United States, and then gestures towards the lands that the United States has acquired from France under the terms of the Louisiana Purchase. One of the real important acts of this type of map is the erasure of indigenous populations, which this goes all the way back to the end of the 15th century. The European and later map makers in the New World drew the places that they lived in such a way as to essentially evacuate lands that had been and were still occupied by millions upon millions of native peoples. The biggest change in the shape of the country in the 19th century and the promoter of new forms of division was the acquisition of the top half of Mexico at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, when the United States acquired the top half of Mexico and it became the bottom third of the United States. extremely controversial war that was protested by many people, by political bedfellows, but was in many ways most powerfully objected to by people who did not want to extend slavery across the continent. This painting is a representation of the United States in 1848 with reference to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The painting is called War News from Mexico. And what I want to suggest to you is that what we're looking at here is indeed a representation of the United States as a people and a place. If you can read the sign at the top of the porch, it says the American Hotel. There's a spread eagle with a shield of the United States on its breast. So what we are looking at here is supposed to be graphically a representation of the people of the United States who occupy America, who live in the American Hotel, not to be confused with the Hotel California. So and so then what, if this is a representation of the United States, of the people of the United States, what do we see here? And what does this tell us about division or union? So what we've got here is this guy in the center of the frame reading a newspaper. He's reading, of course, the war news from Mexico. And around him are gathered an array of other white men to whom he is reading this news, as people would have done. It's actually an astonishing group of people who are standing on the porch or sitting on the porch with our kind of news crier here, because although they probably look kind of mostly similar to you and me, at the time they would have looked like an extraordinarily diverse group of people. You have city guys and country guys, sort of clearly like an immigrant sort of fellow. There's the old and the young. There's wealthy and poor people on this porch. Presumably, the guy reading the newspaper knows how to read. It's not clear that everybody else, all of them, know how to read. And so in many ways, the people that are on the porch represent and are a celebration of the democratization of American politics during the Jackson era, in which by 1848, all poor white men in the United States could vote. And it was brand new. Nowhere else in the history of the world was anywhere else in the world was suffrage so extended. It was called universal suffrage at the time because it was such a radical departure from the previous practice of requiring the demonstration of property ownership or tax payment or literacy or any other number of things for any white man to vote. So here we have on the porch a celebration of American democracy and its extension. But there's a lot else going on here beside that celebration. So on the one hand, if you look to the pillar on your left of the porch and follow it up to the top, you can see that where the pillar meets the portico, that it's rotting, right? So there's something kind of not quite right about what's going on here. There's a sense of decay, even though we're talking about a very new country. There's a lot else going on in this portrait. If you move if you move your gaze all the way to the right, you see a woman leaning out below an open kind of 6/6 window. 1848 is the year of the first Women's Rights Convention, the first time that women demanded the right to vote. So this white woman who is not allowed on the porch, which is where voters and citizens occupy the space, is nevertheless deeply interested in the war news from Mexico and listening in as if she is perched or poised to enter that political sphere. And then in the front of the frame in the lower right, a Black man is seated with presumably his child who's dressed in rags. And the fact that the child is dressed in rags is communicating to us that these people are enslaved and are not allowed on the porch, but are rapt at hearing the war news from Mexico. And indeed, the consequences of that treaty will affect Black people more than anyone, since in fact, the acquisition of those territories does extend new parts of the continent and opens them up to slavery and really extends the institution of slavery, and in many ways is itself this moment what sets in motion the process that leads to the Civil War. But a thing in terms of thinking about this as an image of unity or division, the representation of the relationship between people and place, I just want to point out to you that it is that Black man and his child who are in red, white, and blue. They are essentially a flag in this image of the United States. which is an image of their disenfranchisement, but is actually an argument for their enfranchisement. By the 1850s, after the big political compromise of 1850, under which California enters the United States as a free state in exchange for a number of pro-slavery considerations, including the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. By the 1850s, people began representing, map makers began representing the United States this way, which I think is probably immediately familiar to you as the way Americans think about the country today. And it's in fact, probably in some ways quite similar to how you might, in your own, the picture that you carry around in your own mind, how you might think about the country today. But this is brand new in the 1850s. That is the practice of coloring in the states in order to represent their political affiliations or positions. So here we see the states that are colored white are states where slavery is not legal, where slavery is a violation of the state constitution or outlawed in another way. And the states that are colored black are the slave states. And then we have these unorganized territories. This is a really powerful way ideologically to represent how the country works. This is called freedom and slavery in the overland territories. And we'll see more images like that. I want to pause at this. This is the first photograph we've seen. This is from 1864 of the famed abolitionist and speaker Sojourner Truth, herself a former enslaved person. And here we have, if you recall that image of the iconographic allegorical representation of slavery as the female figure with the kerchief, in some ways, Sojourner Truth is gesturing back to that. But somehow her kerchief in many ways become a liberty cap. So it's kind of transitional here. This is a celebration, 1863, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation. We are still in the Civil War. This is a celebration of the end of slavery, of passage of emancipation. But there's quite a lot more going on in this really uncanny portrait of Sojourner Truth, because although she looks sort of like, a darling, quaint grandmother, and then there's something kind of almost twee, right? Like Holly Hobby, like about, oh, isn't that a cute grandmother person with her shawl and her knitting? That's not what's going on here at all. That's a bait and switch. Because if you look at the portrait more closely and you look at the knitting that's in Truth's left hand, but then you look at her right hand and you follow the trail of the yarn as it goes away from her right hand and follow it down below the little white triangle over the shawl. Now we see the Great Lakes, and you move your finger along to the right all the way up to Maine, the peninsula of Maine, down along the Atlantic coast to the peninsula that is Florida, to Louisiana, down along the Gulf of Mexico to Texas. And now here we have a map of the United States as made by the hands of this woman. This is cotton that she's also knitting, right? So this is a very elaborate, forceful, and powerful, I think persuasive image arguing that the country has been built by the icon here, by the people who were held as slaves. Like this is, we are free, we are a free people. This is our country. We are citizens. We own this country. Like this, we built this country. It is an incredibly ambitious representation, somehow disguised as something very ordinary and quaint. But it's playing with all the different ways of thinking about the country that I've been showing you thus far. This is an image from the very same year, 1864, that does a little bit like the work that I showed you in that freedom and slavery map from 1856, but now in color. It's printed in color. It's our country as traders and tyrants would have it. It's a map of the disunited states, imagining the United States as being constituted by these three different, essentially new nations that this map maker sort of imagines emerging out of the tremendous catastrophic violence of the Civil War. And after the Civil War, there's a whole new set of images that emerge that borrow from and also extend so many different earlier. Here's Lady Liberty now without her cap, but in her flowing gowns. somehow flying across the Atlantic, flying across the country from east to west, stringing telegraph wires across the country. And this is just an allegorical representation here of American progress. So increasingly, liberty is kind of conflated with the representation of progress, by which by the late 19th century, Americans understand not as moral progress as it was understood in the 18th century, but as technological progress and as economic growth. The idea of progress has really changed by now. But there's still some very old tropes here. This is a representation of the triumph of what Frederick Jackson Turner would call in 1893, the triumph of savagery, of civilization over savagery, as Lady America, as progress crosses the continent. Native peoples flee her advance and flee the advance of all the people whose she makes the land open to. So the telegraph wires cut into the land, make possible the tracks on which the railroads will travel, and those resources, natural resources, and built resources and infrastructure make possible the movement of all these different pioneers who are coming across in covered wagons, tilling the fields. It's a continuation of, we could have looked at many images from going back to the 16th century that represent the act of European and later American conquest across the continent in somewhat similar fashion. It's a very long-standing representation. There's a lot to see and read here that's going on. But with regard to how Americans understood an image like this, those who were sympathetic with this depiction would have understood this as a representation of what makes possible the tying together of the older part of the country, the eastern states, and now the western states, which are these lines of transportation and communication, the telegraph and the railroad. So Americans were really anxious about the growing size of the country, because the bigger the country got, the more politically divided the country was going to be, because people have political interests that are defined by where they live. So how it's supposed to be mediated was by the ties that would hold the country together. That idea goes back to James Madison and the Federalist 10. Madison came to think that the newspaper would hold together a very sprawling republic. That didn't really work. The newspaper didn't hold the republic together. And people invested their faith in the telegraph or the railroad in the same way that, in our lifetimes, people invested their faith in the idea that the internet would hold the country together. Turns out technology is never the right thing to put your faith in with regard to political unity. There are all kinds of ways that Americans began to think about the country, the shape of the country, the relationship of the people to the land in the great era of the emergence of modern statistics, because map makers are able to generate maps like this and draw maps like this. This is an incredibly sophisticated map of woodlands density that is part of spurring, what would become the conservation movement and spurring federal land policy in the late 19th century. In some ways, a whole different discussion from this. But one of the things that's interesting about this map is that it does not draw state lines. We're looking at a map of natural features. Even there are borders that are drawn on here, but they're not prominent. What's prominent here is the natural landscape itself, which has its own really important role in what we would call an environmental movement. That same rise of statistics makes possible this map, which is the very first map to plot the election results of a presidential election by precinct. It's an incredibly exciting map. If you look in the inset map at the bottom, that's the results of the Electoral College. But the main body of the map, this is looking at the election of 1880, is rendered in much greater detail. And I think it's kind of just a coincidence that this is red and blue. Red and blue are not typically used to represent the two major political parties in this period. I don't know, maybe they were easy dyes to use for this map maker, but I think it's actually worth spending some time staring at this map and thinking about the continuity of political divisions in the United States by region or by urban versus rural character. There's a lot of work that could be done to do that. But my point here is really just in thinking about how Americans picture the country themselves, not who they are, but how do we picture the place where we live and what divides us. Um, this this of course becomes very conventional and becomes popularized. This map appears in a scholarly atlas. It's not something that ordinary people would see the way we all now see the political map of the United States, kind of haunting our sleep. The 1880s represented a really significant turn in how the United States constituted itself as a people, how Americans constituted themselves as a people, both with reference to the sort of celebration of and fetishizing of Lady Liberty in the form of this, kind of glorious new statue in New York, but that celebrated American immigration and the longstanding commitment of the United States to serve as an asylum for the hungry and hounded peoples of the world, as was understood by the founders of the country in the 1770s all the way through this period. But the 1880s also represents the era of the first truly profound Immigration Restriction Act passed by the federal government, which is the Chinese Immigration Restriction Act. Here's a political cartoon suggesting that a statue for our harbor, that is San Francisco Harbor, ought to be this, racist caricature of a Chinese man here telling immigrants not to come. The 1880s represented a period of immense political reaction in a number of ways, the beginning of the Jim Crow laws, which will undo all of the gains of the 14th and 15th Amendment and reduce many former enslaved people to a status that is hardly better than slavery. There's a whole lot that's going on in the 1880s that's reactionary in this way. And federal Indian policy becomes still more fierce and really truly catastrophic in the 1880s as the federal government extends its power and exerts its military power across the West. You see in the same period this very weird middle-class culture then of representing the country in jigsaw puzzles as a very common children's toy. And it's often a very creepy way of representing the country that is in many ways produced kind of at the height of Americans' vision of what would animate in the United States the eugenics movement, kind of the set of ideas of racial hierarchy that dominate kind of middle class culture in the United States in this period. So this dissected map of the United States from 1887 depicts Lady Liberty here. She's got her little Liberty cap on, showing the country to this, very racist depiction of this kind of diminutive indigenous person who's semi-naked and who here in this service needs to be instructed by Lady Liberty what the boundaries of the possession of lands across the continent are. I just find this to be like one of the creepiest images I've ever seen. This is just another image I wanted to show you about the increasingly sophisticated study of the natural world that finds its place within works of scientific publication. There are many other ways, and I could talk for a long time and often do, about how political cartoonists represent the United States, and I have a few more of these I want to show you. But I want to just pause on this one image, which is a hot air balloon representing the people as the People's Party. And to think a little bit about populism in the 19th century, because we talk about populism today all the time. Populism here and around the world today is a movement of the right. It's nationalist, it's often ethno-nationalist. In the 19th century, populism was a movement of the left. It was a movement of wage laborers and farmers to demand that the power that had been taken by the federal government from the people be returned to the people in the form of a series of signal populist reforms, which included graduated federal income tax, minimum wage and maximum hours laws, the abolition of child labor, the enfranchisement of women, nearly all of which, however much mocked here by the elite press on the East Coast here, just that populists are a bunch of people full of hot air. They look like idiots here. All of the things that left-wing populists were calling for in the late 19th century became the political agenda of the bipartisan progressive movement and were later adopted. I mean, that's how we got the federal income tax and the 16th Amendment, which made it possible. But so there's just to suggest that there are many, many ways that we represent the country graphically, historically. This image does not like a through line between this image and some stuff that we see today. But I think a lot of the idea here that elites make fun of populists for being stupid. But in fact, many of the things that populists are asking for are things that will really improve their lives and maybe be for the good of the country is one thing to see here. This is another super creepy dissected map of the United States from 1893. And I don't want to linger over it. It's also a bad image, but it lines up the supposed peoples of the United States all in highly racialized caricature. The Irishman who's in the middle, the Asian and African peoples, who all of whom kind of are part of this story, but are demeaned in this representation. It's this is the story to teach children about the country is a really weird part of, but important to reckon with, piece of late 19th century American history. The United States reached for empire in the 1890s, reached for empire beyond the bounds of the continental United States, which was extremely controversial. Here's a political cartoon complaining about Uncle Sam here reaching for Cuba. Right. So this is a cartoon whose point is to suggest that it is a very bad idea for the United States to try to swallow this little fish that is Cuba. This political cartoon also shows the sort of strangeness and maybe the overreach of the reach for the Philippines, the U.S.-Philippines War, of course, at the time. There's a lot of ways that these the acquisition of these possessions, that lead to the acquisition of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, have kind of wreaked havoc on American sense of what the country is. And there's a whole racial and racialized discourse to this that I don't have time to get into, but is quite an elaborate feature of this story. The women's suffrage movement by the beginning of the 20th century has adopted many of the conventions of the abolitionist movement. And here we see, not unlike the maps we saw from the 1850s that divide the United States into the free states and the slave states, here the United States is divided into states that have granted women suffrage and those that have not. So although women didn't gain the right to vote as a matter of constitutional amendment until 1920, the Western states, when they entered the Union, generally entered the Union having granted women the right to vote as a matter of states' rights. So here, Lady Liberty, again, is marching across the continent, bringing progress, but not from east to west, but from west to east, to liberate these, the masses of people deprived of their basic political rights as she crosses the continent. The gaining of women's suffrage took place at a time when there was this very strong anti-immigration movement in the United States that would result in a series of laws beginning in 1921 and ending in 1924, which restricted immigration from Europe, established the U.S. border control, the border of Mexico, well, and also Canada. And a representation of that kind of division that also doesn't come down to our day, but was prominent then, is this notion of a funnel, that what should exist at the border of the United States is not a wall, but a funnel. How this funnel works is there are basically eugenics tests to determine who is allowed in and who is not allowed in, and in what percentage different peoples from Europe are allowed in. By 1925, the beginning of the tremendous innovation that is radio, we see maps that show the traffic of radio communications across the country that participate in the fantasy that the sprawl of the Republic, which is causing immense political division and the kind of constant fight over regional political differences, that this can be addressed by a new national form of communication, which will be radio. The beginning of the Second World War inaugurates an era in which Americans are increasingly told to celebrate the country as a nation of immigrants, of one people from many countries. There's a whole kind of world of placemats, kind of like Howard Johnson placemats that I even remember from my childhood, that have this sort of multicultural American diversity story, 1930s style, at a time when the fascist states of Europe were implementing genocidal policies based on categories of racial and ethnic identification. Americans attempted here to repudiate that, the degree to which those categories existed in the United States. Not least those African Americans who have been fighting for decades for an end to lynching, for equal rights and an end to segregation, sit-ins in the 1930s through lobbying and political agitation for anti-lynching bills, none of which are passed, are signed by FDR, passed by a Jim Crow Southern Democratic Party. The Second World War, though, ushers in an age when Americans come to see the country differently, as a superpower on the world stage. So there's this kind of fascinating coincidence of the emergence of the comic book, which I think dates to 1934, and the superhero. So of course, Superman, but also Captain America and Wonder Woman, who both Captain America's from 1940 and Wonder Woman makes her debut in 1941. And they offer a particular representation of the United States. Wonder Woman is created to fight for women's rights. She has this suffrage mission, which is really interesting, which is slightly different than Captain America's mission, but here you see him taking down Hitler, which is something that Wonder Woman does a lot as well. The prominence that the United States would assume after the war as the leader of the liberal world order, a league of modern liberal nation states, is prefigured here in this really beautiful photograph of FDR in his office with the globe. I want to just pause for a minute. I've written a new book about a pioneering data science company called the Simulmatics Corporation. And one way that Americans begin to think about themselves by the 1950s is as bits of data to be fed into a computer. 1952 is the first election in which a computer is used on election night to tally the results. It's a UNIVAC used by CBS News. And there's an increasing prominence of this version of a computer in it's the mainframe computer that's built for commercial purposes rather than military purposes. It's built for the US Census Bureau, that the counting of the people and the sorting of the people and the segmenting of the electorate is increasingly done computationally. Is something that begins to be a way Americans think about themselves. And when they think about themselves that way, they tend to elevate to positions of enormous cultural prominence the men who work with those computers. So here are MIT engineers. This is right after Sputnik, 1957. It's almost Atlas-like. They have the weight of the world, the free world is in their charge as they examine these computer printouts. So there's this incredible elevation of the scientist, especially of what comes to be called the computer scientist, but in this era is called the computer man. In 1960, Time magazine puts on its cover as Man of the Year, the scientist. Like just any the celebration of a certain kind of science. We can also think about the prominence of the highway system and how Americans think about and increasingly travel across the country, and how Americans think of the highway system as something that could address political division. But there's also an awareness that the United States continues to suffer from profound political divisions and even alienation from other parts of the country, something that I think comes across in this Jasper Johns map from 1961, which the United States are somewhat bleeding. There's also a lot of dystopianism about what it means for the electorate to be categorized and segmented and sent specific messages by political candidates. Eugene Burdick was a political theorist from the University of California, Berkeley, who was asked to work for the Simulmatics Corporation which did work for the Kennedy campaign in 1960, and he refused and instead wrote a dystopian novel about the work that Simulmatics Corporation had done, which included segmenting the electorate into 480 possible voter types. There's increasingly an alarm on the part of political theorists, at least, and some canny observers, that the greatest threat to political functioning in the United States will in fact be coming from the work of data scientists who are going to segment the electorate for purposes of political messaging. The 1960s, of course, also witnessed the flourishing of incredibly powerful rights movements, including the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, obviously the civil rights movement, which is decades and decades old, but is visible to Americans who had not seen it before, becomes newly visible through television in the 1960s, and of course becomes the fulcrum on which American politics turns, party politics turns in the 1960s, which actually, all of which ask Americans to think differently about the place where we all live. Whose land is it? The rights claims and the sovereignty claims, the claims for native nationhood that have been continuously asserted by indigenous peoples reach a new audience and become a part of a much bigger public conversation, especially during the occupation of Alcatraz starting in 1969. But as historians would suggest, the chief force of political division that emerges out of the 1960s is maybe not the civil rights movement or not in response to the civil rights movement and those who would resist the passage of civil rights legislation, but it is the divide among the people of the United States over the Vietnam War, which is manifest graphically in all kinds of ways. And this just infinite more to say about this, but this is just a beautiful silk screen, protest silk screen. But the political battles over Vietnam usher in the age of sloganeering, kind of, the Make America Great Again sloganeering era that is very much characterizes our politics today. Begins with the bumper sticker, America Love It or Leave It in 1971. So unbeknownst to most Americans, what would become the internet is being built at this time. Increasingly, people involved in that work began to think about how it might usher in a new era of human companionability and connection and peace and political unity. There's also a wholly new way, it's new in the sense of prevalent in popular culture, way to think about the artificiality of national political divisions, an urge to think about the world as a planet. This image becomes the icon for the modern environmental movement. The bicentennial of the United States Declaration of Independence in 1976 elicits a lot of new ways to think about the country during an era of tremendous political division. I just happen to really love this bicentennial flag by an African-American quilter from Alabama. Down to our, just kind of leaping ahead down to our own day, the technological utopianism of the developers of the internet really cannot possibly be underestimated. The vision that the country would be newly connected, that divisions of wealth and income would be remedied, that political divisions, religious divisions, ethnic and racial divisions, all would be addressed by just wiring everybody up, was very much the founding philosophy of Wired magazine, something that is actually indicted by the Korean American artist Namjoon Paik in this electronic superhighway installation at the Smithsonian, which if you haven't seen it, you really should. Down to our own day, though, I think what most of us carry around is the sense that the country is fundamentally and irreversibly divided, because we so often look at maps like this. This is a sequential series of chronological maps that are showing the changing viewership of CNN and Fox News. We're asked all the time to look at maps like this to see how, in fact, networks of communication, rather than holding the country together, are splintering the country and deepening its divides. Our political language, of course, has become only more polarized as our politics has become more polarized. Liberals calling themselves progressives, all their language is about change and progress, has a very long history. The Tea Party, of course, not not embrace, and conservatives not embracing change and what progressives would call progress, but embracing tradition, and a return, sort of make America great again, a turning back the hands of the clock, the sort of William F. Buckley's, stop history argument. So we get down to the Make America Great Again slogan and see that it has a very long history, as do the slogans, the countervailing slogans on the left. But this political map that, as I've suggested, goes back to the 1850s and the very first representations of the nation as having different colors based on its political affiliations, is very much with us. If we look at the election results from 2016, I think they bear some resemblance to the map we saw from 1888. We look all the time, every day in our newspapers at maps like this. This is from last summer, mapping COVID cases by place or mask wearing by place. This is from a few days after the election this fall, when people were constantly hitting refresh, watching for the returns to come in from the states that were still counting their mail-in ballots. There's this cartoon really speaks to me about kind of the trap that we are in by virtue of, in fact, of many forces, but among them, the representation of vision of the United States. The staring at this map all the time, I think, makes the problem seem much worse in many ways than maybe it really is. So that's what I had wanted to kind of lay out for you, and was to just kind of give us some tools to think historically about how we picture the country, how the country has been divided, what those fractures have been, maybe less what they have been, but how they have been represented by people making representations. Because I guess the question, that we are left with is, in a fractured, dissected country, what is it? What are our obligations for acting responsibly toward the reparation of these divisions? So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a fascinating topic and talk, and I agree with you. That last image that you showed of the person looking at their partner's face as being a map of uncounted votes, I think we all kind of lived through that together. This is Chris Araki from the HAA. We do have a number of questions for you, and our time is short together this afternoon, so I want to jump right into them. One of the first questions we have is an interesting one, which is, what can history teach us about how to build empathy with each other?
I don't know that I would look to history for your answer to that question. I would look to poetry. I would look to fiction. I would look to your faith and your religious practice. I guess I think that's a burden that history can't bear. History is full of extraordinary violence and atrocity. The lesson of history is the lesson here of it's really, I think, the lesson that the framers of the Constitution learned by reading history, right? Benjamin Franklin, maybe it was in the 1750s, he wrote a little essay called Observations on Reading History. And because Franklin always take notes on stuff, and he decided, well, he should read some history to figure out people, because he didn't find his understanding of human nature from religion. He's deeply anti-religious guy. So he read history to try to figure out what makes people tick. And it got him really discouraged. It's this essay people always divide into parties, and then other people will convince people and to hate other people. And then the people that do that convincing will gain power on the basis of getting people to hate other people. And then but that's why we have the Constitution we have. In fact, our Constitution is designed by people who expect that what a political community will do if the people are fully enfranchised is eat each other alive. So our checks and balances are designed to stop that, but they all rest on the assumption that is the natural tendency of people. So I don't know that empathy is what you gain lessons in empathy are to be found. Like you can read biographies of people who are wonderful human beings, but you probably do better to surround yourself with people who are wonderful human beings than read about them.
Noted. Our next question comes from Elliot Rosenbaum, Harvard College class of 2012. He has a question about authorship, in particular around maps. If maps helped form or depict a sense of national and state identity, it seems map makers have an outsized role in shaping the American identity. Were map makers themselves overwhelmingly white and male? And if so, were there any examples of maps made by women, enslaved or other Black people or Indigenous people that were entered into our mainstream?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's one of the most important map makers of the 19th century was a white woman whose name I am forgetting, but her maps, which are crazy interesting, are in a book. I think it's called Mapping America. And the author has a website where she has loaded up all of the maps. Another place I would urge you to look is David Rumsey's map collection, which is also all digitized and online if you want to study maps and think about them. I'm not sure that I would suggest that map makers wield so much authority. I mean, I think they are, they're often doing commissioned work for hire that they're asked to do in a particular way. They're also, reflecting changing technologies. And I think that because I can't represent it easily in this form where it's just fun to show slides, I've just decided on Zoom you should show slides because who wants to, look at the Hollywood Squares thing. But if you think about, so it used to be the case that like during elections, on election night, what you would do if you lived in a big city on election night, you would go to the newspaper office in town and they would have usually a system of lights to tell you who was winning, like searchlights from the roof of the building. The New York Times did this, the New York Herald did this. And when they after electricity, when they used colored lights, they would use like green lights to show the Republicans were winning, or, yellow lights to show the Democrats were winning. But NBC Radio had a colored map at 30 Rock at Rockefeller Plaza. And like, I can't show you that. It's not like the creation of a map maker. It's some publicist, some PR guy at NBC who thought it'd be cool to have this giant lit up map. And they're like, it would be incredibly fun. It's sort of like election night used to be like New Year's Eve. Like you'd go spend the night outside. If you lived in a city, you'd go spend the night outside watching the countdown, like waiting for the ball to drop, but it would be for like the map to get lit up. So I think there's much more kind of vernacular practice of maps and how we receive them than just jigsaw puzzles and the kinds of things that I am talking about. It all becomes subsumed in the form that television takes beginning, I think it's 1952. In 1952, with black and white television coverage, but CBS decides to put up this giant map on the wall of the studio, because Studio 54 in New York above the Grand Central Station. They have this giant map and but it's black and white. So they do, I think Republicans get black, the states get black when Republicans win, but Democrats get zebra stripes. Like it's, so there's like a lot of this stuff out there that is, telling you that your state is where your political identity is founded. And then the nation is kind of a different configuration. Are there alternative mapping traditions? Yes. And in a different version of this lecture I've given over the years, there's this incredible history of indigenous map making. Indigenous peoples made maps all the time, of course, long before Europeans came to the Americas. And most of those maps don't survive, but many do. And they're fascinating, and they have quite a different conception of what needs to be on a map. So there's an incredibly interesting indigenous tradition of map making. A map that I didn't show that is interesting with reference to the question, Elliot, is there are these pamphlets that are part of the Green Book. So the Green Book that tells Black travelers where they could possibly spend a night or get a meal or stop to use a bathroom when they're on the road traveling through Jim Crow states or non-Jim Crow states. Like, what are the places where you can't stop, or you're going to get service, you won't be able to get gas, you're risking your life. This is, so there are these incredibly interesting Green Book maps. There are maps of the United States, but including only the places that are safe for African-American people to go. There was an installation in New York at a museum. Which museum was it? I'm sorry, I can't remember. That was, I saw it a couple of years ago. It was an installation that was a room that was made into a Green Book map. And so there was like a little highway and you could walk around it. And then you had to figure out which way to go. I think at the Museum of African American History, the incredible Museum of African American History in Washington, they have this great exhibit, which is like a car. So it's some old, like, Buick or something from the 50s. And you get in it, and then there's a map, and there's a computer program, almost like you're doing GPS. And let's say you have to get from New Orleans to Galveston, Texas. And like, you have to use the Green Book to navigate how you could get there. So that, like, studying that and actually making that concretized for children to understand, like, this is a country, but then this was the only part of it. Like, these were networks within the country that were safe for Black people. Is a kind of embodied as a history lesson in the museum. So there are lots of ways to come at this question. I'm just babbling now, but in terms of like Black map making tradition outside of the Green Book, I don't have a ready answer, but I'm sure there's a rich body of scholarship on that.
Well, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Carol Sesserdo. And Carol asks, historically, the U.S. has experienced anti-immigrant sentiment. How has this sentiment been ameliorated in the past? And what does history tell us about increasing positive attitudes about immigrants in the future?
So positive attitudes about immigrants generally correlate historically with eras of prosperity. So the better off the country's doing economically, the more welcoming the country is to immigrants as a matter of policy. So I guess, like, in some sense, that's not surprising. But it's also the case historically that, so David Hollinger, a historian of the University of California, Berkeley, has written that his understanding, he has a book called Post-Ethnic America, and his argument is that the heyday of the civil rights movement in the United States corresponded with the period of most reduced immigration in the United States. That is to say, as if there's like a faucet for like the bestowing of rights or something, or tolerance for difference somehow, because his argument is that one of the things that kind of shuts down and ends the classic period of the civil rights movement, which leads to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1964 Voting Rights Act and the 1968 Fair Housing Act, is the 1968 Immigration Act, which opens up America's borders again after they've been like really significantly shut down since 1924 with the National Origins Act. But that it is the Immigration Act which lifts many of those restrictions that Hollinger argues kind of spells doom for civil rights, like as if you could have one or the other. So I think the things to look for if you were to examine the phenomenon. Carol, I suspect your question assumes that the answer is to do with what people believe and how they feel and what they think about immigrants. But in fact, what the factors I think you would want to look chronologically against, periods of, high immigration or low immigration would be to chart on that chronological timeline. You'd also want to be looking at prosperity and periods of economic decline, and you'd also want to look about civil rights successes and civil rights losses. I think those are the things that are in a structural sense, most immediately in the mix.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few more questions. Andrew asked you, Professor Lepore, how do you respond to people who have a strong knee-jerk reaction to disparage any attempt at reinterpreting history as revisionism?
I guess, you know, if I were sitting down in a room with someone who had that, I mean, I think that view often is something that has been proposed to the person who holds the view that they didn't necessarily come up with themselves. So, I have never found it hard to face refute that opinion. I mean, like I would just say, like, okay, so you know how many kids are in your family? You know, okay, there's 4. Okay, well, do you have the same version of your childhood and your family's dynamics that your sister and your 2 brothers do? Like, and so if you have different, okay, so everybody has a different version of their family. So like, what's different about it? Like, who's got the most different view? Well, my brother has the most different view. Okay, well, my brother thought that my father was a saint, but I thought my father was an ass. And like, he was so mean to my mother. Like, okay, so what could account for different views that the 2 of you have, having grown up in the same family? And that kind of Tolstoy, like every happy family. And kind of get at that, like, okay, so did you have different experiences? Do you have different evidence? Have you continued a relationship with your father and your brother has not? Like, here are 2 people who have a shared history and they have different accounts of its meaning and significance. Surely that is true of larger histories, of a history of a community, of a history of a state, of our nation, or a movement, or a presidency. Okay, so if we then, okay, so you kind of move that person to like, okay, so let's stipulate then, like, no, and if they say, no, my version is true and my brother's version is wrong, like I'm just right. And I'm like, well, okay, so that you're fundamentally incurious about how people view human relationships and the passage of time. So we can't, then you shouldn't study history because you have to be curious about human relationships and how your view of them changes with the passage of time. But if like, you can't just be right and you can't just be wrong. So I like at a face-to-face conversation, I start there and, you know, most people are like, oh, I never thought about it like that. Is that really how history works? Like, yeah, but in the same way, like if you're having a fight with your brother and your brother kept saying that you're a terrible person and you pull out a letter that your father wrote to you before he died, in which he said, I so wish that I'd been able to repair my relationship with your brother. I once told him that he was good for nothing and never going to make anything of himself. And I regret that because it was spoken in anger, but he's never let me tell. Well, then you have a really good piece of evidence. Maybe you could persuade him, like, this is what historical argument is, right? That you have to bring evidence to bear to defend your different interpretation. I don't know, people get that. I think it just be not about like, my version of history is in defense of court packing. I have a version of history that I can offer you that makes clear that what we should do right now is change the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And if you want to tell me that you have a version of history that makes clear that we shouldn't, well, then we have an irreconcilable difference. Well, that's not the study of history. That's just the use of history to make a political argument. That's different. So if your brother wants to say, yeah, Dad was such an asshole to me that even though he left us his estate in equal parts to all of us, I should get more of it because I was really treated badly by him. Well, that's not a historical interpretation. That's just using history to make an argument. So again, like I try to kind of lay that out. I think there's like the knee-jerk like anti-revisionism is just some like desiccated, pathetic byproduct of the 1990s culture wars. Like, let's put that behind us.
All right. I think another question that we could ask you is, if history can be a guide, where would we be as a country politically and socially in 10 years or 25 years?
Something can be a guide and not be predictive. So back to the family story. Your experience of your relationship with your father has probably guided you and the decisions you made about how to raise your children or maybe how to treat your spouse. Are you fated to be a bad spouse because your father was a bad spouse? No, like it's just not predictive. Like it informs your view of the history can inform our view in the world. Where things go from now, I recognize that it is maybe even a lucrative activity to prognosticate as historians. And you see people on TV all the time saying, well, given that when FDR took office on March 4th of 1933, he in his first 100 days was able to, because of the nature of the crisis, and although the country was divided, and therefore will X on January 20th. No, like that, it's useful to think about FDR. I'm sure something to be learned there. I think about FDR a lot. But would I venture a prediction about the Biden presidency based on the Roosevelt presidency? No, I just think intellectually is silly.
And our last question is from Charlie Ulmer. And Charlie asks us, do you believe that this era is particularly polarized and a divisive time? My takeaway from your lecture is that division is the norm in US history, always existing and never going away.
So that's an interesting question. The way in which I try to think about polarization is I begin by setting aside the political science research on polarization, or at least kind of bracketing it, because political scientists measure polarization through congressional votes. So they have data that goes back to the first Congress in 1789-90. So that, of course, only tells us about members of Congress. And if we want to measure polarization in the general population, there are other measures, but you can't really undertake those until about 1948, when the University of Michigan started doing the American National Election Survey. So you have this huge amount of public opinion data about the electorate starting in 1908. So again, if you want to measure polarization as a quantitative political scientist, you can measure congressional going back to 1790. You can measure the electorate's polarization going back to 1948. And if you do that, you see that polarization is kind of the same until the 1850s, and then it's crazy. That's kind of the same for a while. And then since about 1965, it's been crazy and just going up. So the obvious empirical answer is polarization. There have been periods of polarization before, but we are only in the second really giant period of polarization. But I tend to bracket that on one side because before 1965, Black people could not vote in most of the United States. And before 1920, women could not vote. So none of these measures, at least until 1965, is actually measuring the polarization of the people. And I think that you could think about people held in bondage or under a system of apartheid segregation as a population, as a political party, essentially a shadow political party. And there's just no day before 1965 in the Voting Rights Act that the interests of a disenfranchised Black voter isn't extremely polarized from the interests of people who are trying to continue that disenfranchisement. In other words, all of American history is hugely polarized until we get to the point where we can measure the polarization of everyone. Because what we're doing is just suppressing the measurement of the political opinions of people who are disenfranchised. So in other words, if you want to argue looking at the political science data, polarization begins to rise after 1965, what does that really tell you? When 1965 is the time we're first able to really measure the political views of everybody. So it may be that although political polarization has been on the rise since then, it's actually only that we're only first capturing and measuring the polarization that's been there all along. So I don't think that question, that discrepancy in the data has really been answered yet. Another just to say that polarization is crazy high. Like it's a crazy screwed up time. Like there's no other way to describe it. But I don't think when people say, have we ever been this polarized before? I just think like the first thing to do is to say, let's remember that we is all the people in the United States, not just the people that political scientists have data about because they were able to vote or because they were able to be members of Congress. So when you kind of blow apart that we, then it's a much more complicated picture.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Jan to jump back on so we can close out the program. Thank you so much, Professor Lepore.
Thank you so much, Professor, for so brilliantly linking us to the past, to the present, and then back to the past again. That was really wonderful. And I just want to remind our participants that there is a survey, and if they could fill that out when we sign off, that would be terrific. And again, thank you so much, Professor, and I'm wishing everybody a very happy and healthy holiday season. Oh, my video's off. There we go. Now I'll say it in person. Happy and healthy holiday season, and thank you all so much for participating.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.